Picture this: a ship carrying 6,000 ppl, sailing straight at rough weather instead of running from it. That's not a disaster scenario. That's what actually happened to one of the world's largest cruise ships in 2016, and the footage terrified an entire industry. But here's the part nobody explains properly. This isn't really about whether ships can survive a hurricane. It's about why the industry now treats that question as one it should never have to answer. Let's start with the basic strategy, because it's simpler than most people assume, and also more mathematical than most people assume. Cruise ships don't fight hurricanes, they outrun them. A typical cruise ship cruises comfortably at around 20 to 30 miles per hour, while a hurricane itself, the storm system as a whole, generally moves across the ocean at somewhere between 10 and 20 miles per hour. That speed gap matters enormously, because it means a ship with several days of warning can simply reroute around a storm's entire projected path rather than gambling on riding it out. Every major cruise line employs dedicated meteorologists whose entire job is tracking these systems days in advance, feeding real-time satellite and buoy data straight to the bridge so captains can adjust course before conditions ever become genuinely dangerous. Meteorologists can typically track a storm's likely path 5 to 7 days out with increasing accuracy, which sounds abstract until you realize that's roughly the length of an entire cruise itinerary. To put the scale of an average hurricane season in perspective, the Atlantic sees an average of around 14 named storms a year, 7 of which typically become hurricanes, and 3 of those typically strengthen into major hurricanes. That's the backdrop cruise lines are operating against for 6 full months every year, June through November, with the real intensity concentrated between mid-August and mid-September. Given that volume of storm activity, full cruise cancellations remain genuinely rare because ships have room to maneuver that land-based destinations simply do not. Insurance data backs this up, too. A comprehensive travel policy typically runs somewhere between 4% and 10% of total trip cost. Priced the way it is precisely because full weather-related cancellations happen so infrequently relative to how often storms are actually out there churning across the same waters cruise ships sail through every single week. There is also a real financial calculation running quietly underneath every one of these decisions. Cruise lines lose real money every time they reroute away from a port or cancel a stop entirely. Refunded excursions, unhappy guests, reputational damage that shows up in booking numbers months later. And yet the industry consistently chooses that cost over the alternative, which tells you something concrete about how the actual risk calculus gets made behind the scenes, regardless of what a published itinerary promises passengers on the day they book. Here is a genuinely counterintuitive point that cruise line meteorologists bring up constantly, and it is worth sitting with. Most people assume the open ocean is the most dangerous place you could possibly be when a hurricane is bearing down. It is actually closer to the opposite. A house or hotel on land is a fixed target that cannot move out of a storm's path, no matter how much warning residents get. A cruise ship, by contrast, is one of the few structures on Earth capable of relocating an entire small city's worth of people hundreds of miles away from danger in a single day, simply by changing heading. That mobility is the entire advantage in a single sentence. It is not that the ship is somehow immune to a hurricane's force. It is that it almost never has to find out, because it left the area days before the storm ever arrived. So what actually happens on board when a storm does get close enough to matter, even without a full-blown crisis? The outdoor decks closed first, pools drained, water slides roped off, jogging tracks shut down. Big theatrical shows that depend on a stable stage get swapped out for smaller acts that can work around real motion, and shore excursions in an affected port often get replaced with an extra day at sea. Passengers typically get moved indoors, sometimes asked to stay in their cabins entirely if things get rough enough, and the captain starts giving regular updates over the PA system, both to keep people informed and, frankly, to keep them calm. For most passengers on most cruises during hurricane season, that's the entire experience. A slightly rocky night, a missed port, maybe a shipboard credit as an apology, and a good story to tell afterward. Behind the scenes, the engineering that makes any of this survivable is working constantly, not just during a crisis. Anti-roll tanks built into the hull can shift water from one side of the ship to the other to counteract heavy rolling, working alongside the retractable stabilizer fins most passengers have at least heard about. On the bridge, officers track barometric pressure, wind speed, and wave height continuously, cross-referencing what their own instruments are reading against updates coming in from onshore weather centers. None of that gets mentioned in the daily activity newsletter slipped under your cabin door, but it's running the entire time you're deciding between the buffet and the pool bar. Before any of these ships ever carry a single paying passenger, their hulls go through simulated stress testing well beyond anything a typical hurricane encounter would realistically demand, which is part of why cruise lines can speak so confidently about a ship's seaworthiness even after a night like the one Anthem of the Seas went through. For anyone genuinely prone to seasickness, crew hand out motion sickness remedies proactively once conditions start building well before anyone has to ask. Interior, lower, midship cabins tend to feel the least motion, which is exactly why experienced crew members request them for themselves when a ship is expecting weather, a small detail that tells you everything about which parts of these massive vessels actually move the least. But then there's February of 2016, and the Anthem of the Seas, which is exactly the story that changes how you should think about all of this. The ship left New Jersey on a scheduled 7-day cruise toward Florida and the Bahamas, carrying more than 6,000 passengers and crew. Forecasters had predicted a developing weather system off the Carolina coast, strong but manageable, something the ship's own weather team believed they could navigate around comfortably. Then, over the course of roughly 8 to 10 hours, that system intensified far beyond what anyone had forecast. Wind gusts recorded by a NOAA buoy hit 76 miles an hour, technically hurricane force, with waves reported as high as 30 feet in the immediate area. Some onboard television displays reportedly showed wind readings well over 100 miles an hour during the very worst of it, numbers the captain himself later called one of the most challenging stretches of his entire career. What made this particular storm so dangerous wasn't just its strength, but its speed of development. Forecasters had been tracking a relatively ordinary weather system, and in less than half a day, it transformed into something producing conditions typically associated with a genuine hurricane, catching both onshore meteorologists and the ship's own weather team off guard. Passengers were told to stay in their cabins as furniture toppled, glass shattered, and in at least one section of the ship, a ceiling panel actually broke loose. 4 people were injured, none of them seriously, but the footage and first-hand accounts that leaked out afterward painted a genuinely frightening picture. Passengers described holding onto their mattresses through the night, water sloshing out of bathroom faucets sideways instead of straight down, glasses tumbling off counters in cabins across multiple decks. One passenger later described feeling the ship tilt what she estimated at 45 degrees, convinced in the moment that the ship might actually roll over. Here's the detail that almost never gets mentioned in the retelling, and it might be the most important part of this whole story. The U.S. Coast Guard, using the ship's own instrumentation, measured the actual maximum list at 18 degrees, less than half of what it felt like from inside a windowless cabin with no fixed horizon to judge against. Fear and physics don't always agree, and that gap between perceived danger and actual structural risk turns out to be one of the most important things to understand about any ship caught in bad weather. The ship's builders, incidentally, had already engineered it to withstand conditions considerably beyond what it experienced that night, according to statements the company released afterward. If you're the kind of person who wants the real numbers behind a scary night at sea rather than the panicked version, stick around, because this only gets more interesting. The like button helps more people find this. The captain fought to keep the bow pointed into the wind for hours, the standard technique for minimizing a ship's exposure to a storm's worst broadside forces, before conditions finally eased late that night. Royal Caribbean ultimately turned the ship around entirely, canceling the remaining itinerary and sailing back to New Jersey rather than pushing on toward Florida, and issued full refunds along with a 50% credit toward a future cruise. Company leadership later admitted plainly that if they had known in advance how severe the actual conditions would become, they simply wouldn't have left port at all. A U.S. senator publicly called for federal investigators to examine why a modern cruise ship had sailed into forecasted hurricane force conditions in the first place, and the incident triggered real scrutiny of how much risk the industry was willing to tolerate in the name of keeping a published itinerary. Royal Caribbean responded by promising to strengthen its storm avoidance policy company-wide and add more meteorological staff dedicated specifically to reviewing these decisions before a ship ever leaves the dock. The National Transportation Safety Board, which happened to be deep into its own investigation of a very different maritime disaster at the exact same time, noted publicly that the Anthem incident might offer useful lessons about how cruise operators handle heavy weather compared to other parts of the shipping industry. The company also committed to hiring additional support staff specifically for its marine operations office, the team responsible for making these routing calls in the first place, and promised a broader internal review aimed at catching exactly this kind of rapid, unexpected intensification earlier next time. Now here's where this story gets genuinely important, because there's a direct contrast that puts the entire cruise industry's caution into perspective. Just months earlier, in October of 2015, a different kind of ship made a very different decision facing a very similar situation. The Faro, a 40-year-old American cargo vessel carrying shipping containers and vehicles toward Puerto Rico, sailed almost directly into the eye wall of Hurricane Joaquin, which was then a major Category 3 storm and briefly a Category 4 storm. The captain believed, based on weather data that was already several hours old by the time he acted on it, that he could pass safely south of the storm's center. He was wrong. Crew members can be heard on the ship's recovered voyage data recorder expressing real doubt about the plan hours before disaster struck, with one crew member bluntly noting that nobody in their right mind would be driving into what they were driving into, a comment met with a sarcastic laugh from another officer on the bridge. Built in the mid-1970s and refitted under a series of different names over its long working life, the vessel was still legally permitted to operate under safety standards that predated much of the modern regulatory framework governing newer ships, a detail investigators would return to repeatedly once the scale of the tragedy became clear. By early morning on October 1st, Faro had lost main propulsion, was taking on water through a scuttle that had blown open during the storm, and was listing heavily with no working engine to correct course or escape the storm's core. Within roughly an hour of the captain's final distress call, describing a hull breach and a heavy list with no propulsion, all contact was lost entirely. The wreck was eventually found nearly 3 miles down on the ocean floor, its bridge separated from the rest of the hull. All 33 crew members died, making it the deadliest American maritime disaster in more than 3 decades. Investigators later found the ship's lifeboats had likely never even been launched, that the aging vessel had outdated safety equipment grandfathered in under older regulations, and that a properly enforced weather avoidance policy, paired with a genuinely seaworthy, well-maintained ship, could plausibly have prevented the entire tragedy. The subsequent federal investigation issued more than 60 separate safety recommendations. A subsequent lawsuit accused the ship's owner of allowing a non-seaworthy vessel to sail directly into a known hurricane, and within roughly a year, the company had settled with the majority of the crew members' families for a combined total in the millions of dollars. It helps to hold that single, widely publicized night up against the sheer scale of the industry around it. Tens of millions of people take a cruise every single year, the overwhelming majority through hurricane-prone waters at some point in their trip, and the Anthem of the Seas incident remains one of the very few times in modern cruising that a major ship has been caught that badly off guard by a storm's true strength. That rarity is itself the point. It's rare precisely because the entire system, forecasting, routing, and a genuine willingness to eat the cost of a canceled port is built specifically to make sure it stays rare. It's worth pausing on just how different these two outcomes were, given how similar the underlying threat actually was. Both vessels were caught within striking distance of a major hurricane. One had 6,000 frightened, but ultimately unharmed people turn a terrible night into a story they'd tell for years. The other lost every single person aboard, with a wreck that took investigators an entire month just to locate on the seafloor. Put those two stories side by side, and the actual answer to what happens to a cruise ship in a hurricane starts to look completely different than the question implied. It isn't really a question about naval engineering at all. Modern cruise ships are absolutely built to handle severe weather far beyond what a typical passenger will ever personally experience. Tested hull designs, powerful stabilizers, redundant propulsion, and power systems throughout. The real difference between a ship that survives a brush with a hurricane and a ship that doesn't almost never comes down to whether it could theoretically survive direct contact with one. It comes down to whether anyone on board or ashore was willing to make the decision to avoid that contact entirely, days in advance, based on data that's often uncertain and constantly evolving. That's exactly why the modern cruise industry has become almost obsessively conservative about storms since that February night in 2016. Dedicated meteorological teams monitoring every major fleet around the clock, standing internal agreements to reroute rather than gamble on a forecast holding steady, a genuine willingness to cancel entire itineraries and eat the financial cost rather than risk another Anthem of the Seas. The ships themselves were never really the fragile part of this equation. The judgment calls made before a single wave ever hits the hull always were. So the honest answer to what happens to a cruise ship in a hurricane, in almost every real case, is nothing dramatic at all, because the ship was never actually there when the hurricane arrived. The drama happens days earlier in a windowless operations office where a team of meteorologists and officers quietly decided the safest story was the one where nothing happens at all. Once you start noticing how much of a cruise is engineered around risks nobody talks about, it's hard to stop looking. Subscribe, because next video looks at something that happens on almost every single cruise, every single night, right after sunset. There's a very specific, largely unspoken reason cruise ships almost always sail after dark, and it has nothing to do with saving time.